going to chair that. I'm going to chair that session. Thanks a lot first, Raphael, for having organized all this so smoothly and nicely. And our first two speakers of this morning are Frank Hindriks and Francesco Guala about the nature and significance of social ontology.
Okay, so I'm going to do the presentation, and then maybe Frank will help me answer some of the questions in the Q&A session. Let me share my screen first. Okay. Right. So thanks everybody, but especially thanks for the organization of this workshop. And so we took our job, our homework to be this, or at least these are. We take some of the questions that we're expected to answer collectively, presumably during this workshop. So, what is social ontology, how it should be practiced? And in particular, we think that we cannot answer meaningfully or in any interesting way these questions if you don't make some comparisons. I mean, what is social ontology compared to what? I mean, how does it differ from other disciplines or other activities that seem to do similar things? And obviously, the big question, at least for the last 200 years or so, that philosophers are asked is, how does philosophy relate to science? I mean, when we pretend to talk about, how the world is, there is somebody else who does that all the time. And, one of the questions is, what is the relationship between what we do and what scientists, social scientists in this case, do? But there is also an issue. We think, there is an important relationship between philosophy and folk ontology. And we're going to talk about this quite extensively as well. Folk ontology obviously being, the sort of commonsensical view of the world, which we all have. Okay, so we think that, I mean, one answer, or at least a respectable answer to these questions, is that social ontology is meant to provide the bigger picture. I mean, to explain how it all hangs together. And obviously the underlying motivation is to understand the way the world is. And if this does not sound very illuminating, we will try to explain what we mean by that by showing what we have been doing, or what we think we have been doing all along in the past few years. We will start from what we think that social ontology is not. And we find it useful to sort of try to map the territory by using this simple picture. So we have put three elements here. There is social science, there is folk ontology, and there is, philosophical social ontology, or what philosophers do. And we think that this is useful to try to define three positions that are extreme positions and that we don't agree with. So what are the extreme positions? I mean, the extreme positions are the positions of those who think that one of these approaches, or one of these disciplines, if you wish, suffices as a basis for doing ontology. And basically, you can do ontology within one of these disciplines without really bothering about what is going on in the others. And, what does it mean? I mean, it means that, starting, for example, from the bottom left, there is a position that we might call scientism, which is the position according to which science tells us everything that there is to know. There is what we might call folk intuitionism, according to which ontology is basically a matter of explicating our folk intuitions, or to give maybe a refined version of our ordinary commonsensical conception of the world. Phenomenology, broadly speaking, may be part of this approach. There are also philosophers who think that there is a room for a sort of purely philosophical social ontology. Presumably, the idea is that ontology is a kind of a priori endeavor that can be pursued by means of conceptual analysis. Several analytical metaphysicians seem to subscribe to something like this. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, we do reject all of these views, and our approach is basically an ecumenical approach. So we sort of take the middle road, and we try to defend the view that ontology is indeed a philosophical discipline, and one of its aims, probably the most important for us, is to provide the bigger picture. And it relies, in order to do this, it relies, that it must rely on science and also on folk intuitions as inputs for philosophical social ontology. So basically, our picture is something like this. So just a few words to explain why we hold this view. So why not autonomous armchair philosophy? I personally have some problems even understanding, how one can do any armchair philosophy. Presumably, the idea is that we can reflect on concepts, and that this provides some kind of a priori knowledge. But it seems obvious to us that our concepts are not always adequate. And the best that philosophers can hope is that our concepts can provide knowledge of how the world is, if they are adequate. And this is often, at least in part, an empirical question. Now, in practice, this kind of armchair autonomous philosophy often means that philosophers end up analyzing folk concepts, or maybe a refined version of folk concepts. So maybe it's better to talk of folk intuitions in the first place, which would put us in the bottom right corner of this picture. So why not folk intuitionism? Well, because our untutored intuitions are sometimes wrong. I mean, maybe often wrong. And, maybe in the field of social ontology, they're not, our, folk social ontology is not as frequently wrong as folk physics, maybe, but it's still fallible. And our intuitions must be checked rigorously and systematically. You might say, if you wish, scientifically. But then why not scientific ontology then, which is, again, we're back to the bottom left corner. Well, first of all, obviously, because scientific theories can also be wrong, although at least, science is supposed to be self-correcting. But remember, that scientists, many scientists, for example, are often instrumentalist about their models or parts of their models and theories, which means that we cannot take scientific models literally or seriously from an ontological point of view, at least some of the time. And science also does not always provide a coherent, complete, unambiguous picture of the world. So the scientific picture of the world constantly requires filling in, interpretation, bridging between theories, and so forth. So to sum up, I mean, we are really fallibilists all the way. we take that scientific theories as well as folk intuitions can be misleading, sometimes mistaken, just as, you know, a priori philosophical social ontology obviously inherits this fallibilism. I mean, you might say that this is not a particularly novel view or position, and you would be right. I mean, it obviously reminds us of things that, you know, famous philosophers have argued we should be doing a long time ago. Is it just Sellars' program then? Well, in part it is. I guess we, like many contemporary philosophers, are maybe less optimistic about the internal consistency of the scientific and the folk image of the world. And as a consequence, we think that there is a lot more work to do to come up with a unified, complete, sensible ontological picture. So these are basically what we take to be the goals of social ontology. And so develop a coherent picture out of scientific theories and folk intuitions, create unity, especially out of the dappled world of science, explicating folk and scientific theoretical commitments, determine to which extent each of these can be saved and resolve inconsistencies, both across domains, but also within each domain, so within science and within the ordinary worldview. It's a messy process. There is no simple recipe, or at least we haven't found it yet. But we think it can also be a very creative and productive process. And in particular, it helps to build bridges, not only with sociology, economics, anthropology, and, you know, the other social sciences, but also with law, political theory, ethics. And this is an important point. I mean, we will come back to this at the end of this talk, but it's an important point because social reality, unlike, you know, other parts of ontology, is definitely imbued with normativity. And this is something that scientists often try to explain away by psychologizing it, for example. But it is important, we think, to take it seriously because normative attitudes constitute social reality. And they play an important role both in justification, in sustaining social practices, and obviously also in intervention and social action. But we'll get to this point later towards the end of our talk, if we have time. Okay, so what are the outputs of social ontology? So we propose here a distinction, a rough distinction, obviously, between what we may call social ontology in the narrow sense and social ontology in the broad sense. Narrow here means in a sort of disciplinary, philosophical sense. So social ontology in the narrow sense is involves the sort of questions that only philosophers ask, mostly because, you know, others are not terribly interested in these kind of questions, certainly not the folk, but also social scientists are often not interested in these kind of questions. But there is also social ontology sense, and social ontology in the broad sense overlaps, at least partly, with, for example, the psychology of action, with game theory, with social and political theory, with economics, anthropology, and so on. And we don't think that you can do one without the other, really. And in our work, in fact, we have addressed both the more abstract questions that belong to social ontology in the narrow philosophical sense, and to questions that belong to social ontology in the broad sense. So, for example, we have worked on institutions, constitutive rules, social norms, social objects and their functions, but also on more specific issues like, money, what is money, marriage, and traffic lights, as we are going to see in a minute. So let us give you an example of how we can put in practice some of the things that we have just outlined in a very general sense. So this is a familiar social object, right? It's a traffic light, and we kind of all know, or we think that we know what a traffic light is. So, the obvious temptation, especially, if you're a philosopher in the tradition of sort of ordinary language philosophy or something like that, is to start, by trying to figure out what are the ontological presuppositions of the way in which we conceptualize traffic lights, the way in which we talk about traffic lights, the way in which we think about traffic lights. And so the inputs from social ontology may be of various kinds, but we take that according to our ordinary intuitive conception of the social world. Well, traffic lights are middle-sized dry goods, as Austin would say, with a coordinative function. I mean, this is not a particularly mysterious function, and we take that most people understand this. We know quite a bit about the way in which artifacts like traffic lights are conceptualized by ordinary people. And one of the most prominent theories both in psychology and in philosophy is that artifacts are identified by their intended function, and in particular by the function that was assigned to the artifact by its creator. Notice that already here we're in sort of kind of hybrid territory, in the sense that psychologists have shown that the identification of artifacts can follow different routes, and there has been quite a lot of debate about whether there is one principal way in which people identify or conceptualize artifacts. And this little theory that I am summarizing here is actually the outcome of a lot of work, a lot of empirical work in psychology. So, it's a good example of how folk intuitions and science have to go together in order to come up with a sort of general and empirically justified view. Right, so the use of artifacts obviously is governed by rules, right? Like, the user manual that you get when you buy a new washing machine. But these kind of social artifacts are slightly different, because they are governed by institutional rules. And these institutional rules often involve obligations, unlike artifact rules. They're non-instrumental obligations, in the sense that it's not like, you have to do this, otherwise it won't work. But they're really peculiar rules and obligations. They're not private rules. They're largely conventional. They have to be shared in a community, otherwise the traffic lights will not work. So, as you can see, I mean, there are a lot of interesting questions that our intuitive picture of traffic lights brings up. And these folk intuitions or folk views are a good starting point for doing social ontology, but are also fallible. And often they are narrow. I mean, they're narrowly focused. I mean, traffic lights belong to a wider class of social entities, which we may call coordination devices. And if we want to understand how they work in general, if we want to really have the big picture, we need a different approach. And science actually helps. quite a bit. So for example, social science can help us to identify the kind of problems that traffic lights solve. And in our own work, for example, we have used game theory to conceptualize the sort of strategic interaction that that is typical of these coordinative devising. This is a classic game known as hawk, dove, or chicken. And it's a standard game that has two equilibria in pure strategies. One where the cars coming from one direction, or the cars who drive on the north-south axis, stop, and the cars that drive on the west-east axis go. And obviously another equilibrium that is just symmetric. Both of these equilibria are somewhat unsatisfactory. And they're unsatisfactory in a normative sense. So we will, that's why normativity in this case is important. Because it would be weird, at least for us, to have a coordination device that makes some people always stop and other people always go. So introducing a traffic light and the relevant rules can change this game, and it can create a new equilibrium, which in technical jargon is called a correlated equilibrium. And in a correlated equilibrium, assuming, for example, that red and green are shown with approximately 50% probability when you approach the crossroad, or red and green are shown 50% of the time, then we can create a third equilibrium, which you can see in the matrix on the right, where there is an equal payoff or an equal utility for both types of drivers that drive from north to south, south to north, and those who drive east-west or west-east. So, we take that this is not entirely trivial. We're going to see in a minute also how does it help to do other things. But first of all, one important payoff of this more general scientific view of traffic lights and coordination devices is that it helps appreciating that traffic lights have something in common. Actually, they have a lot in common with other coordination devices. For some of them, it's not terribly surprising, we guess. It's not surprising that traffic lights and roundabouts are similar, for example. But maybe it is slightly more surprising, or at least not so trivial, that they are functionally similar to borders between countries, or private property institutions, or even animal mating, which is definitely something that common sense will not tell you. So obviously, one thing that a model of this kind does is that it moves to a different level of abstraction. Our common sense intuitions are tailored upon very concrete cases, and a certain level of abstraction certainly helps understanding. Since philosophers are interested in the big picture, that's why one reason why we think that proper social ontology must go beyond folk ontology. There are many philosophical theories that don't do that or struggle doing that, and they tend to focus on exceedingly narrow local mechanisms. We could give several examples, but I know, for example, constitutive rule theory, collective acceptance theories. And the problem with these theories is not necessarily that they are false, in the sense that they do capture some mechanisms that are at work in specific cases, but often they're not general enough. And that's why they're vulnerable to counterexamples. And these counterexamples then are usually accommodated by means of verbal tricks, by changing the meaning of acceptance, for example, or saying that constitutive rules do not need to be formulated explicitly, they can be implicit or something like that. And we think that it's much better in this case is to start from a more general theory right from the start, instead of starting with a narrowly focused theory that then has to be corrected, amended. Now, there is another worry at the other extreme, is that very general and abstract ontological theories may be so abstract that they have little content, and this undermines their significance. Our hunch is that this is sometimes true, that it is an empirical question, and it's not something that can be settled a priori. It really depends how unified or disunified the social world is, and what kind of explanatory questions we are asking. And some answers may require a lot of detail, where others may require less. The kind of theory, or the kind of model that we have illustrated is a good example, I think, of a middle size, or a middle range, abstract enough, general enough theory that is also explanatory. And it gives us some interesting insights also about other things that not only social scientists, but also philosophers care or should care about. So, for example, they tell us something about policy and interventions, the sort of things that we can do to change the way in which the world works. And I mean, the case, the example that I gave earlier, we can change people's behavior, we can create new equilibria by introducing a new technological device, a new coordination device, is an example of an intervention, right? Where we can create something new that didn't exist before. Now, to have a comprehensive ontological picture helps to, first of all, identify what can be achieved in policymaking. So it can identify what is possible, how many equilibria there are, for example, and what are their main characteristics. Here, we mean what is possible in an empirical sense. Okay, it's an empirical matter. It's not a purely conceptual matter, and it's often a matter of costs and benefits of what people can learn, whether people are motivated to change their behavior. This helps also in identifying different routes for intervention. So we're not just interested in what is possible, what can be achieved. We're often interested also in how we can get from X, a situation that we find unsatisfactory, to Y, a situation that we find more satisfactory. The rules in equilibrium theory that we have defended in the past, we still defend, suggest, for example, that you can change equilibria by manipulating rules, by manipulating beliefs, incentives, norms. And there are really different ways in which you can intervene and change social reality. And again, this is really an empirical matter, not just a conceptual matter. There are things that we can only learn empirically. For example, a priori, theoretically, it may seem that changing a convention is easier than changing a social norm. But some people argue, and have also presented some data suggesting that conventions have a tendency to become social norms. So, regardless of what Lewis said a long time ago, this is an empirical question. It's not a conceptual question, okay, whether conventions are normative or not. And it's an important question for policymaking and intervention. But it's also an important question from a normative perspective. I mean, policy is obviously related to values and norms. And that's why social ontology has an important and interesting relationship, not just with the social sciences, but also with ethics, political theory, and all those disciplines or subdisciplines that deal with normative questions. Again, we'll just give an example here. So one of the things that a model like this suggests is that it is possible, that societies get stuck, sometimes for a very long time, in equilibria that have bad normative properties. I mean, equilibria that a lot of people, maybe even the majority of people, do not like. And yet, this kind of theory, this kind of model, suggests that people may have good reasons to follow the rules, to stick to their part in these unfair, unjust, sometimes oppressive equilibria. And we also know that this sounds odd. I mean, to a lot of people, this sounds odd. So we take that, in this audience, maybe, you're not going to be particularly surprised by this claim, but in our experience, many times when we present these ideas in front of an audience, even of professional philosophers, some people really find it odd to say that people may have good reasons to follow unfair, unjust rules. It can be right, is the common experience. I mean, if you have a theory that says this, your theory must be wrong, okay? It cannot be right. So why this reaction? Well, probably because folk ontology, our intuitive way of looking at these situations, is imbued with normative significance. And we cannot help but see the world as right or wrong, to compare what happens with what should happen or should not happen. And this is, it's so pervasive that the language that we use is full of thick terms. We make use constantly of thick terms and thick concepts that are partly normative and partly descriptive. And these thick descriptions do not just convey information about what happens, but they also give us information about what should have happened or about what we should do to make things better. The corrupted civil servant took a bribe from the entrepreneur. I mean, this is not a neutral description. I mean, it's also, a description that is imbued with negative normative terms. So, this way of looking at the world, our commonsensical, intuitive way of looking at the world is imbued with normativity. And in a sense, it carries instructions about action. It tells us what to do to change the world as much as information about the way the world is. So it has a pragmatic function, and presumably in this case, the pragmatic function of having the reaction that I just described. Oh, but it cannot be right that people who are oppressed have good reasons to follow the rules. Presumably, the pragmatic function of this is that it motivates people to take some kind of action, some social action. But notice that, obviously pragmatically, our understanding needs not be perfect. I mean, in fact, it has to work in the sense that it has to, trigger the right sort of actions, actions that are useful for us. And it doesn't matter pragmatically if it's wrong some of the time, or maybe even most of the time, provided that the errors are not too costly. But normativity, the bottom line is that normativity is sometimes, maybe often, a source of error in terms of descriptive ontology. And if ontology is about what there is, then we have to acknowledge that normativity is in the world, it exists, but our job is to understand and explain it, without being misled by it. So we must take an objective stance, not the participant's stance towards normativity. So going back to the example, suppose that we all have this strong intuition that people should not accept unfair institutions. They should advocate reform or rebel against these institutions. To say that they have good reasons to follow the rules seems to legitimize the institution. Now, a good ontology, like the rules in equilibrium model that we advocate, must show that both claims are true. I mean, the claim that oppressed individuals have an interest to follow the rules is true, and it explains persistence, the persistence of institutions. But also it shows that these very same people would be better off under different institutional arrangements or under different rules. So there may well be a different equilibrium with appealing normative properties. And yet it is true that it is not rational to change one's individual behavior unless the others, many other people do the same. So basically it's a collective action problem, something that social scientists and philosophers of social science have been studying for a very long time. So there is a lot more to say about this, and we do not pretend to have exhausted what there is to say about these matters. There is a lot more to say about reasons, the difference between these kind of reasons, about individual rationality or collective rationality. There is a lot more to say about the justification that these reasons give, or the kind of obligation that is associated with these reasons. But we're not going to discuss this because we don't have the time to do it. So we finish on this note, because normativity is one of the central and possibly most complicated topics in contemporary philosophy. And philosophers, especially moral philosophers, but not only moral philosophers. I mean, I think all philosophers feel proprietary about it, because it is indeed one of those topics that distinguishes what philosophers do from what others, and especially scientists, do. So we, or they, we should say, these philosophers are often reluctant to accept external insights about normativity. Now, we, social ontologists, are forced to investigate normativity because norms are an important part of what societies are made of. And we are, we think, particularly well positioned to make important contributions, moving between phenomenology, our folk intuitions, and social science. So perhaps this is a hope, but a founded hope. Perhaps one day we will manage to persuade other philosophers that good normative philosophy requires good social ontology, and that we think will help to legitimize what we do and to bring it to the core of philosophy, which is the place where it should be. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Francesco and Frank, for that great presentation. So we have 14 minutes for discussion. I suggest we use the chat, if you agree, because it makes the Q&A easier to follow. So please write Q in the chat for a question and F for a follow-up. But I see that, Michael, you have already raised your hand, so please go on, Michael. Michael, we cannot hear you. Your mic is off.
Yes, there was some. It said the host has to allow you to reactivate your micro. Anyway, I have a question about this normative ontology in relationship to sellers, because this is the topic of my talk on Friday. So I wonder how you see it. Now, if we take Sellers on the scientific and the manifest image, he says, as you recall, that normative attitudes are constitutive of social reality. But then he says that the scientific image, in leaving out normative attitudes or normativity, does not leave anything out that science can inquire, because if you take a point of view of nova and an objective point of view, you won't find normativity in this objective stance. You will find it only in a stance in which you participate in the social practices of attributing attitudes. And now towards the end of your talk, you seem to suggest just the opposite, namely that we can investigate normativity as a fact that exists in the world objectively, as we do physics, for instance. And at least if you go back to Sellers, that seems to be impossible, because you find facts in the world, but their normativity you don't find as a fact, but only in participating. So how do you see this tension between, if you refer to Sellers on the one hand, and want to do social science in a scientific attitude, scientific image on the other hand? So something that's not fit together here, to my mind.
I just realized now that we haven't have a method to decide who's going to answer. Frank, I don't know, I haven't been talking for a long time. Do you want to say something about this, or?
Your mic is off, Frank.
And now?
Good.
You can hear me now? Okay. Yeah, I guess we are less scientists than Sellers. Like one reason to take the folk perspective seriously is that it is less obsessed with reduction than the sciences, and that also creates more room for non-reductive metaphysical relations like constitution or realization, but it also allows us to accommodate some normative facts, and the idea that there are no normative truths from an objective point of view. I mean, whether we would really want to commit ourselves to that being the case, I don't think so. Whether we want to assert the opposite, I mean, this is very much a project that is underway. But yeah, I guess we would take the folk perspective, including the normative claims that it seems to support more seriously than Sellers.
Yeah, I mean, take a phenomenon like reflexivity or performativity, that has come back in fashion in social ontology. I mean, that's something that Sellers really hadn't thought about. But if it is true, that these norms also shape the way in which we think about, in which we represent reality, and if it is true that values play a role also in science, take something like the inductive risk argument that is now very popular among philosophers of science, then you can already see that the picture is much more complicated than a 1950s or 1960s philosopher could conceive.
Yeah, if I can add one thing. So I've done some work on how people perceive social norms as legitimate, often, not always, of course, and what this might mean and how we can explicate it in terms of a sound theory, maybe in terms of rational choice theory, ideas that are somewhat similar to what Christian Becchieri has claims about legitimacy and norms. Now, when you develop such a theory, you take folk notions more serious than scientists used to do, because they tend to reduce social norms to sanctions, for instance. That was very much in vogue some decades ago. But whether you go all the way to what really is legitimate is not obvious. And that is part of the proper domain of ethics. So yeah, we want to build bridges and allow ethicists, for instance, to connect to the work we do. But there are, of course, very difficult metaphysical and normative questions as to whether we can really connect them in a ultimate way that helps us answer the kind of normative questions that ethicists struggle with. I hope that is somewhat helpful.
There was a follow-up by Don. We can't hear you, Don.
Push OK again, or unmute.
There we go. I think we're good. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, look, it just, the Salarzian perspective as just articulated by Michel just seems obviously too pinched to be right. I mean, consider another example. Take the concept of efficiency. I mean, physicists can talk about efficiency and economists talk about efficiency, and the two notions of efficiency are related, right? I mean, one can write formal models that apply to both, and one should do that to see how they're related. But insofar as some process is merely physically efficient and isn't efficient in the obviously normative sense that economists are interested in, then economists don't regard that as their business, right? I mean, a process that is physically efficient but doesn't bear on economic efficiency isn't something economists are going to want to model or study or bring. So when one says something like, as Ed Leamer often does, economics is a policy science, that's what he means. So if we're wanting to take the Salarzian perspective, literally whole social sciences would actually just be ruled out of court as not being scientific. So he's clearly got to be just wrong, right? If that's the right interpretation of Sellers.
Yeah, well, so we take Sellers as a source of inspiration, right? And in the end, our claim is much better summarized by the triangle, where social ontology has social sciences and folk ontology as inputs. So even if you have a reductive approach where you say, well, the social sciences are not worth much, then we differentiate our views from that.
Jonathan? Your mic is off, Jonathan.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so also on the Salarzian framework, but even as refined into the triangle picture, I mean, obviously this is you're giving kind of a simplified version of things, but of course the folk image is itself already informing the scientific image. It's not as if the scientific image just landed at our feet. The scientific image is itself a refinement of the folk image. So there should be an arrow going from folk ontology, I would think, into the scientific image. I mean, where the Salarzian image can sometimes, at least to me, feel more fitting is when we get from the sciences a kind of sort of purely mathematical formalism in the way that we sometimes get in mathematical physics, where we can kind of drop our ontological presuppositions and just look at the mathematics and say like, oh, can we, how can we interpret this? But that doesn't seem to be what we get in the social sciences. I mean, the social sciences seem to be just infused with thick normative concepts, like even artifact concepts. Maybe like being money is an artifact. And these are normative concepts from the get-go. So it doesn't seem to me like the Salarzian picture is really so fitting. And to get back to Michael's point about the role of normativity, it seems like when we're in the social sciences and we have artifact concepts and other concepts just sort of in there all along, we've never left normativity land.
Yeah, we absolutely agree. I think most of what Francesco was taking bears on that. So yeah, there is a link with sellers, but it's not as strict as you might have thought.
I think we now. I'm beginning to regret that we have brought sellers in, but the purpose of bringing him in the presentation was that. Obviously, these are not new questions, and the approach is not new. And there is a big problem that philosophers have recognized some time ago, which is, what do we make of these different perspectives on the world that we have, right? And part of our job is to try to make sense of the contradictions and inconsistencies, right? So in this sense, it's a Sellarian program, right? But we're not 1950s philosophers, luckily, and we've gone a long way, obviously beyond that, and there are some naiveties in their view of science back then that we think, or we hope, we have overcome. We hope that we as a community have become a little bit more sophisticated, both in the way in which we understand science and the way in which we use or interpret, study the manifest image. And we don't claim that there is anything terribly original in what we are doing, but I think it's it's a descendant. What we do is a descendant of that program.
Maybe it's more original than we thought after all.
Francesco, you have a question.
Yeah. So again, on the topic of normativity and how it plays a role in the example of norms, I was wondering if there's a distinction to be made between the problem of normativity as a subject matter of social ontology and social science, and normativity as used in science itself. Because when it comes to the examples you gave about social norms, it seems to me that the role of normativity is part of the subject matter, but not necessarily of the science or social ontology itself. What I mean is that taking the example of Bicchieri, all that she says about norms, how they're constructed, how they arise, can be reduced to expectations, so beliefs that people have. So certainly there's some of these expectations are normative, but the social ontologist, the social scientist, doesn't necessarily need to use their values. It's not entangled in their analysis of the social norms. Now, of course, the social scientists can select these norms because they believe they are defective and they're bad, but the analysis itself doesn't have to be value laden.
Yeah, no, I agree. Although the topic to what extent science can be value neutral is a very difficult one. But let's work with the idea that it can be. All right. So yeah, a theory like that of Bicchieri isn't obviously value laden. So values do not come in that way. But it's more a matter of where do you take your ideas from. So there are many many social scientific theories that explain why people conform to norms, all the way from sanctions to warm glow theories and then many others. And you feel a warm glow when you comply, so that reinforces what you do. Now, what we want to do is take the reason perspective more seriously, because it seems to play an important role in common sense, and that we act for reasons. And lots of scientific theories suggest that we should play down this part, and we take that seriously. But at the same time, the idea that a norm might be perceived as legitimate is worthwhile to develop in a richer sense also than McGeary does, as I've tried to do a couple of years ago, in order to get to the bigger picture and to include certain folk ideas that would otherwise get lost. So again, to kind of resist the reductive tendencies of science, at least to some extent. And we also believe that reductive theories can be really essential for progress. But in order to provide a bigger picture, you sometimes have to look in another direction and take the folk intuitions seriously.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Frank and Francesco. We have to stop here. So let's thank our two speakers for that great talk and the great answers. So let's take 3-minute break and start again with Eza at 11 sharp. Okay, see you in 3 minutes.